From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and this is part 2 of my conversation with Agi Legutko. If you've not listened to part 1 yet, please go back and check that out first. In the second part, Agi discusses the writer Isaac Bashevis Singer, Yiddish women writers, and the motif of the Dybbuk in 20th and 21st century literature. Here's the continuation of my conversation with Agi Legutko. Getting back to your original reason for learning Yiddish, there were a couple of things that you mentioned, and I wanted to go back to this author that you were so inspired by. Mm-hmm. And you said his name kind of quickly, so I didn't quite get it. What was it again?
Isaac Bashevis Singer. Thank you for asking me about this.
Yeah, tell me, what was so inspiring about him?
So,
What's he all about?
So he was born in Poland, now there are different sort of birth dates, somewhere between 1902 and 1904. He was lying about his birthday most of his life. And in Leoncin, small town near Warsaw, he grew up in Warsaw. He was born into a Hasidic family, but he had sort of like a photographic memory. And his father was a rabbi, like a small, a corner rabbi for like smaller disputes. And Isaac Bashevis Singer, as a child, sort of was watching, people coming to get the disputes resolved. He later captured that in his stories, and he emigrated to America in 1935. So he in his 30s, I guess. And he never went back to Poland. It was a conscious decision. He never wanted to see Poland again, but he wrote about Polish Jews most of his life, right? And he had sort of like two sets of stories set in pre-war Shtetl, pre-war Warsaw, pre-war Poland, and post-war America. So he was sort of really capturing a panorama of Jewish life. And but what was fascinating is that, in Poland under communism, again, as I mentioned, Jewish matters were taboo subjects. So he was never mentioned, right? But then in 1978, he got a Nobel Prize. And suddenly the communist government was like, well, he's a Polish writer, right? He's a Polish writer. He got a Nobel Prize. Hello. And suddenly, he was not published before. Suddenly after 1978, he was published. So I was sort of like fascinated by him. And he's a great storyteller. Like his short stories are absolutely magnificent. And, he's funny. And what I really, really love about him is that he is genuinely interested in the human being, right? He's genuinely interested in his characters, and he looks at them with compassion, right? It's not, some other Yiddish writers have a tendency to sort of mock their characters, to sort of look down, like all kinds of reactions, whereas he sort of embraces the humanity. And he was not without controversies. He was criticized by his fellow Yiddish writers because he wrote about sex, he wrote about Jewish underworld, Jewish prostitutes and thieves. And people said, like, well, you're giving ammunition to anti-Semites. What are you doing? Like, how dare you to write about, that Jews is not noble people. Right, I see. And his argument was like, but these Jews are like any other people. You have all kinds. And, and Krachmalna Street in Warsaw, where he grew up, was sort of a neighbor, like a religious neighborhood, but like on the borderland with underworld. So he also had his family lived on the, I think, second floor that he had a balcony. So he would observe the street from the balcony. And he was my entry to the Yiddish world. Like, I wanted to read him in the original. That's why I started learning Yiddish. And when I came to Columbia, I ended up writing about Dybbuks, but my statement of purpose, like I originally came to write about Bashevis's stories about demons, right? Because so one more thing about his name. So his name was Isaac Singer, but his older brother and older sister were also writers, and his older brother's name was Israel Joshua Singer. So the initials were the same, Singer. Yeah. So he wanted to be distinguished from his brother. He took on a pseudonym Bashevis, which comes from the name of his mother. His mother's name was Batsheva. and Bashevis would be genitive, right? Like the of Batsheva. One of the things that he did during the war, so being here as the Holocaust was happening was very hard for everyone, all the Jews who were here, and especially him. Like his family was still there. It was only his brother and him that were in New York, and he during the war in the 1940s started writing stories narrated by first person, demonic or evil inclination, evil spirit, sort of from the demonic perspective. And it was a brilliant device because it allowed him to say things that he wouldn't be able to say as a regular narrator, right? Because he would be like, well, it's not me, it was the
demon did it.
It was the demon or the Yetzer Hara, which is like the evil inclination sort of and some of the stories, like he wrote a story during the war in 1945 called Gimpel the Fool, which in my opinion, he could have gotten Nobel Prize just for this short story. It's so brilliant. What was unique about him was that he continued to write in Yiddish. He insisted on writing in Yiddish, but he realized early on that in order to be relevant, he needs to be translated into English. There were lots of other Yiddish writers here who continued writing after the war, but he had the sort of savviness to look into the translation as another outlet. And in 1953, Saul Bellow translated Gimpel the Fool, and it was published in the Partisan Review, I think. And this sort of like launched his career in English. And what he did, this was sort of one thing that I found fascinating while getting to him in my master thesis, is that he collaborated with translators. And he had a copyright reservation that all his works can be translated into other languages only from English, not from Yiddish.
Why is that?
Which was very interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because he sort of re-edited the stories for English translation. He was writing for a different audience, and he was very much aware of who the audience was. Mm-hmm. In Yiddish, he's writing for a very specific audience, Yiddish speakers, mostly from at least knowledgeable of religious background, right? Coming from the same geographical or cultural space. Whereas in English, he's writing for mostly non-Jewish readers who are not familiar with the Jewish religion and culture, or maybe Jewish readers, but who don't know Yiddish, right? So it's a different, and also most of his works appeared in Forwards, which was a Jewish daily forward. It's still running, one of the longest running Jewish Yiddish newspapers. Now it's only online, but he published his works in a serialized form. So he was often writing for a deadline, often rushed. And so when he was re-editing the stories, he referred to them as second originals. He modified them, right? But he did not only sort of polish them for in terms of structure, he also changed things with the audience in mind. One of my favorite examples is that in Gimpel the Fool, I'm not going to spoil the story, but there is a moment when Gimpel realizes that all of his kids are not his. Okay. Right? And he's really troubled by that. And he's talking to someone in the shtetl, and he's like, what I should do about it, like what? And his interlocutor says, well, what do you worry about it? Jesus didn't have a father either. And it's like, you can't really write it for Christian audiences, right? That, Jews making fun of, like, what? So this line is removed from the English.
Okay.
And, he would change some endings of the stories. Or another example that I would like to bring in here is he wrote a fantastic story called Yentl, the yeshiva boy, the yeshiva student. Yeshiva is a Talmudic academy for men only. It was written in 1963 in English, 62 in English and 63 in Yiddish, which was quite unusual because usually it was always and it's a story about a girl who wants to study the Talmud and Torah, the commentaries, and she dresses up as a man, as a boy, enters yeshiva, and there are lots of the story develops. There's of course love, and I don't want to again spoil the story. Yeah. But what's fascinating is that in Yiddish, and especially now when gender, we talk so much about gender fluidity and transgender and queer experience. He was writing about it in the 60s, when it was like even before the second wave of feminism. And in the Yiddish version, when Yentl, the protagonist, adopts the identity of a boy, she calls herself Anshel. In Yiddish, the pronouns are switched to masculine pronouns, right?
Okay.
So whenever the narrator talks about Anshel, it's im, right? He, him. Whereas in English, whenever the narrator is talking about Anshel, it's the pronouns are feminine. And it's it changes the perception of the play. It changes the agency of the protagonist, right? So I would say that Bashevis Singer was more understanding and of the gender transitioning than the English translators. Of course, he had a say. So it's a fascinating story. And when I came here, I was beyond excited to find out that he lived on 86th and Broadway. So it's really, this neighborhood. He was a familiar figure. I came here after he died in 91. But I came in the year, so his official birthday throughout his life was 1904. Now documents have been found that he was born a little earlier. So when I came in 2004, it was Bashevis' centennial, and there were lots of various sort of events, to commemorate him. So it's really fascinating for me to be teaching Yiddish so close to where he lived.
Right, yeah. Your inspiration.
Yes, my inspiration is sort of coming back to the source. And also, one thing that I always teach is his Nobel Prize. He gave part of the speech in Yiddish.
Uh-huh.
The way he spoke about Yiddish in his Nobel Prize lecture was absolutely fascinating. And I always teach it to students. And in advanced classes, we read the whole speech in Yiddish. But I'll share it with you now in English.
Sure.
One can find in the Yiddish tongue and in the Yiddish spirit expressions of pious joy, lust for life, longing for the Messiah, patience, and deep appreciation of human individuality. There is a quiet humor in Yiddish and a gratitude for every day of life, every crumb of success, each encounter of love. In a figurative way, Yiddish is the wise and humble language of us all, the idiom of frightened and hopeful humanity. Isn't it beautiful? It gets me every time, that he had this sort of deep understanding of human individuality, right? And how suffering is part of everyone's experience. And this, the idiom of frightened and hopeful humanity is just beautiful.
Yeah, that's great. And do you have a piece of one of his works that we could kind of hear the sound of it? I think I'd be really interested to hear the way, just the
yes.
The way
oh my
it
God,
sounds.
This would be perfect. Instead of hearing me, we should hear Bashevis. And I have it right here. Just one second. So this is an excerpt from when he was receiving the Nobel Prize in Stockholm. There was a banquet that was given in his honor, at which he spoke in Yiddish.
Man fragt mich oft, was schreibst du Jiddisch? Und ich will Trieben geben auf der Frage an Entfer. Mein Entfer wird sein ein Jiddischlacher. Das heißt, ich will entfern mit einer Frage auf eine Frage. Der Entfer ist, warum soll ich nicht schreiben auf Jiddisch? Will ich besser schreiben auf Chinesisch oder auf Türkisch? Wie sagt man auf Türkisch? Haknisch Gatscheinig.
So he's saying that people often ask him, why are you writing in Yiddish? And he says, I will give them a Jewish answer. And what is a Jewish answer? You answer with a question. So he says, why shouldn't I write in Yiddish? Would I write better in Chinese or Turkish? And then he goes into, this was his forte. He says, how do you say in Turkish, hak min nish ken chaynik, which literally means don't bang on my tea kettle. But it means don't drive me crazy, stop bothering me, right? Hak min nish ken chaynik. And I hear from many people that Bashevis Singer, so sort of in Yiddish he functions as Bashevis. That's why I keep saying Bashevis, but in English he is as Isaac Bashevis Singer. That many people sort of are drawn back to Yiddish through his works. If you're looking for something to something new to read. I highly recommend.
That sounds great. Yeah, it sounds like he has a really humanistic and expansive view of what you can do in the language. So he's just, I think he's the main writer that drew you in, but you're interested in many other writers and many other issues in Yiddish. And one of those I know is women's issues in Yiddish, or women writers. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for the question. One of the transformative experiences of my graduate studies at Columbia was taking courses on women and gender. So I TA'd a class, Introduction to Women and Gender Studies at Barnard, and I took a class with Irina Klepfish on contemporary American Jewish women writers. And these two courses sort of opened my eyes and changed forever the way you look at the world through gender lenses. And so now I was able to revisit all my favorite books, and sort of whatever I encounter something new, I look through through gender lenses. So I sort of went back to Yiddish literature, and I was like, hello. I looked at the syllabi and was like, where are the women, right? And when I was taking my MPhil, which is part of the program in Yiddish literature, I was invited by my professor to create a periodization of Yiddish literature. So traditionally, when you talk about modern Yiddish literature, you talk about the three founding fathers: Mendele Mocher Sforim, which is a pseudonym of Abramovich, Yitzhak Leibush Peretz, and Shalom Aleichem, and it's a pseudonym of Shalom Rabinovich. So three guys who basically created modern Yiddish literature. So I juxtaposed them with four matriarchs, going back to the biblical arrangement, with the four Yiddish women poets who were iconic writers, modernist writers, who wrote incredible poetry in the 20s and 30s, who were, like, some of them were, like Kadia Molodowski, for instance, were celebrities in Warsaw, and then they came here, and sort of the gender dynamic in the Yiddish literary milieu was complicated, to put it this way. Sort of women were marginalized, objectified, perceived only through the lenses of their connections with men. And one of my discoveries was poetry of Celia Drobkin, so one of the matriarchs I suggested. And I was blown away by how brave, progressive, and bold her poetry was. She talked about erotic love, sexuality, and gender in a way that I never expected to hear from writers, from the 20s. You sort of, and this is what I love about, my job and doing, that you have some notions and then you go and challenge them and see, like, no. People did talk about sex. People did talk about oral sex. People did talk about, sort of gender dynamics. So one of the poems that there are many, but one of that really sort of spoke to me was her talking about pregnancy through the lens of possession. And the poem is, I'm paraphrasing in English, you didn't sow a child in me, you sowed yourself, and you keep growing and taking over my space. My soul has no place. Like, and I was like, wow, this is
wow.
this is amazing. Or then she has a poem about her mother who became who widowed at 22, and she has this line that her mother's longing in the nights, she never remarried, so her mother's longing in the nights was transformed into the source of inspiration and is coming out of her through her poetry. And I was just like, wow. And this is also something that I always love to share with my students, to sort of look at this incredible poetry that's written in Yiddish at the time that you don't think people are talking about things like that. And it's always, there's still so much to do. There are still so many women writers to discover. There has been a lot has been happening in that realm. Starting in the 70s, there were lots with the second wave of feminism, and especially sort of the Jewish feminism that was closely connected and sort of grew out of it, and feminist scholarship in Yiddish. A number of of researchers and scholars, Irena Klepfish among them, the poet who taught at Barnard, started sort of rediscovering and reclaiming Yiddish writers. So there was a collection of short stories called Found Treasures that was published in the mid-90s, which was the first collection of Yiddish women's short stories. And, the general perception was like, oh, women don't write novels, women don't write short stories, they only write poetry, right? Because sort of, emotional, personal, this whole story. So this was like a groundbreaking moment that, wow, look, there are so many women who wrote, and there are novels, and now there were a few other collections that were published, but then it's sort of like it goes in cycles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now I would say there is another wave of translating Yiddish women's prose. So, for instance, one of our Columbia graduates, Dr. Jessica Kirzain, who teaches at University of Chicago, who teaches Yiddish at the University of Chicago, has translated a book called Diary of a Lonely Girl by Miriam Karpilova, which again is so based in New York. It's about New York from 1918. And she's translating another book right now. So there is... Professor Anita Norwich translated a sort of autobiographical memoir of Kadia Molodowski. So there is a lot happening again and in terms of sort of thinking of Yiddish scholarship and applications of Yiddish for our students beyond college translation, right? So Yiddish Book Center has now a number of translation fellowships that you are paired with a senior translator and you can work together. And I think like the future of Yiddish in that sense is becoming brighter, that there's so much to do, so many opportunities, and it's sort of this amazingly beautiful and rich world of Yiddish literature and culture is awaiting for explorers.
So another area of your research is the motif of the Dybbuk, this demon that possesses people. And I was wondering if you could lay out some of the contours of this motif, how it exists in literature for people who might not know, and then talk a little bit about why it seems to be a subject of continual fascination for people throughout the ages.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. This is the question I was that always is music to my ears. So spirit possession is a global phenomenon, right? And spirit possession in Judaism does appear in sources, sort of biblical sources. King Solomon was said to have possessed expertise in exorcising demons, right? So there was a sort of spirit possession on the Jewish radar from the very beginning. But what's fascinating and unique about Dybbuks in a way is that these are not demonic entities. These are souls of the dead that enter the living bodies, that possess living bodies. And Dybbuk, sensu stricto, emerged only in the middle of the 16th century, in 1540s.
Okay.
And it sort of grew out of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism, which sort of talked about Gilgul Neshamot, transmigration of souls. And from this concept, sort of the Dybbuk possession emerged, right? So that the souls enter, according to Kabbalah, souls usually of sinners, but not only, in order to, are not allowed to enter the world to come, and they have to go through the process of sort of purification, atonement for their sins, and they can enter plants, some animals, and the last stage is human beings. And my first encounter with the Dybbuk was in one of the classes I took. I think it was a class with Jeremy Dauber on Yiddish theater, and we read Shin Ansky's Dybbuk, a play that was written during the First World War. The first draft was ready before in 1914, but then he sort of was reworking it throughout. And he tried to stage it at the Moscow Art Theater with Stanislavski. It didn't happen, and he died, Ansky, in 1920 in Warsaw. And at his grave, and this was like a very spectacular and dramatic statement, one of the Yiddish theater directors said, "We're going to stage the play to Ansky's Shloshim," which is 30 days after 30 days of mourning. It's a period according to the Jewish law. And they did. The play opened on December 9, 1920, became incredible hit. And what was interesting, it was that the Yiddish critics were very skeptical because Ansky had led an ethnographic expedition in the years 1912-1914 in the Podolia and Volhynia regions, sort of Central Eastern Europe. And he encountered the Dybbuk story there. And he sort of wanted to incorporate the story into the play he was working on. So this is a story of a girl and a boy fall in love, but the father of the girl wants to marry her off to a rich boy. The boy is, of course, poor, the one she loves. And he dies. He's trying to get rich through Kabbalah, which is forbidden, and he dies in the process. And on her wedding day, she becomes possessed by his soul, by the Dybbuk, by him. And then there is sort of a spectacular exorcism connected with a trial. And should I spoil the ending? And
okay, so spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. And she dies in the end. So this is the story in a nutshell. And the traditional sort of conventional interpretation of this was, well, she's this passive victim of possession. She becomes a vessel for Hanan, for the groom, her beloved, that possesses her. And I looked at the play again through my gender glasses, and I was like, wait a minute, it's not that simple. There is something more happening. And when I went back and reread it, she orchestrates the possession. She is an active agent in the possession. And as I was doing research on it, I also did a lot of research from the anthropological point of view, because this is a sort of worldwide phenomenon. And from the anthropological perspective, for the spirit possession to occur, there must be a belief in spirit possession in the community, in the given society. And when you look at Ansky's play, right before the wedding to the boy that the father arranged, she goes to the cemetery. This is a Jewish custom to invite your dead relatives to your wedding. And here she encounters the messenger, who is sort of like this mysterious figure in the play, who tells her about the Dybbuks. And right then she goes to the grave of Hanan, her beloved, who is already dead, and she invites him to the wedding. And she invites him, and she says that I will carry your soul as if I was carrying our unborn children. So she basically invites him to possess her. So she orchestrates the possession. At the wedding scene, there is another aspect that's fascinating, that sort of grew out of Ansky's expedition, that in a number of shtetls, the small towns, he encountered a grave of a bride and groom who were murdered on their wedding day by Khmelnytsky Cossacks. So this relates to a historic event. In 1648, there was a Khmelnytsky uprising in what is now Ukraine, but it was part of Poland then. It was civil war in Poland. It was, the Cossacks were rebelling against Polish nobility, but the victim, as always, were the Jews. And Khmelnytsky, his soldiers sort of organized, we wouldn't use the word pogrom for that, but what was basically pogroms, they murdered whole communities. And this was such a dramatic atrocity that it was shock to the system of all the Jewish communities. And so until the First World War, Khmelnytsky massacres were the largest atrocity that happened in Ashkenazi Jewish history since the destruction of the Second Temple. So when you can think, right, we're talking now from the perspective of the Holocaust, which sort of overshadowed everything that was before. But this was really like a major trauma for the Ashkenazi Jews. So Ansky saw those graves, and this was a way, and I was very excited to be able to incorporate Mariana Hirsch's, our very own Mariana Hirsch's idea of post-memory, right? How trauma of one generation possesses subsequent generations, because this grave in those shtetls was a way of transmitting the collective memory of the past trauma. And what Ansky did was he placed this grave in the middle of a shtetl in the play. And right before, so we're at the wedding scene, right? She has the veil on her head. She's about to get married to a guy she doesn't want. And she says at first in her own voice, "No, you're not my bridegroom." And then she throws herself at the grave that's in the middle of the town and says, "Holy bride and groom, protect me, help me, protect me." And this moment she becomes possessed. She turns around and says, and then she speaks in the voice of Hanan of the Dybbuk. It's an amazing scene. But my reading of that was, first, she says in her own voice, "You are not my bridegroom." So she is consciously rebelling against what's being imposed on her. She's taking control of her life. Then she throws herself at the grave. And this is, again, a Kabbalistic, mystical custom of prostrating on the graves of to invite the soul to possess you. And only when she becomes in physical contact with the grave, she becomes possessed. And, from, again, anthropological point of view, possession is often used by the oppressed and the marginalized members of society, usually women or queer men, status-deprived men. And through possession, through the idiom of possession, you can say things that you normally would not be able to say, right? So it's not you, it's the Dybbuk speaking through you, right? So this was the same device that Bashevis did, right? It's not me, it's the demonic narrator. And what happens in the play is that she disrupts the wedding. She doesn't marry the guy she doesn't want to marry. So she takes control of her life, of her body, of her sexuality. And she puts her own father on trial, which is also fascinating from the feminist point of view. I can't really think of many other scenarios where a woman can yell at the rabbi, which she does during the trial as a Dybbuk, right? But and at the end, the Dybbuk is exorcised. So they are going to bring the groom again, do the marriage again, right? Because exorcism is considered as a way of restoring the disturbed order, right? So restore the patriarchal control over women. But Hanan's, the groom's soul is in the vicinity, and Leah, the bride, they have a conversation, and she says, come to me, my groom, come to me, my husband. So when you think about speech act theory, she pronounces the married, right? Because she says, come to me, my husband. Right. This is like I do, right, in the ceremony. And she chooses to die. So my take was like, no, because when I was giving talks about the play, people say like, well, but she dies in the end. And I'm like, she chooses to die, which is a difference. And they get united in the world to come, because there's no opportunity, no possibility for them to exist in this world. But I don't see it as a sort of tragic ending. I see it more as she takes control over her life and she gets what she wants in death. Unfortunately, but she does. So this was such a discovery for me, the play. And then I started looking at production history, and I was like, I was fascinated by what's happening. Why do people keep going back to this play? And I've seen a number of productions here in New York. I've seen there are a number of movies that were made, and I was trying to understand sort of more of what the fascination with the play tells us about modern human experience, a modern human condition, right? Why in postmodern times we're looking back to this motif. And I was sort of thinking about this is one of the ways is that we live in a sort of post-secularized world, and here is some kind of a spiritual, mystical connection with the between worlds, right, aspect of it. I was thinking about the Jewish experience per se, which is always between worlds, right? Yeah. You are Jewish, but you are also you live in a non-Jewish world. And Ansky himself, Shinansky is the pseudonym of Shlomo Zandvil Rappaport. He himself also was sort of possessed by other cultures. Like he was born near Vitebsk, and for many of his years he was, passing as Russian. He was very deeply involved in Russian politics, exploring Russian folklore, and only at some point, and it was sort of connected with the pogroms, and there was a blood libel trial in 1913, which was like a turning point for him. He returned to Yiddish, and he said in one of the speeches that celebrated his artistic achievement that a Jewish artist always lives on 2 streets with 3 languages, right? That you're always between worlds. So, and this is the subtitle of the play. So I think this corresponded to that. And finally, and this is the argument in the book that I'm working on right now, that I think this stands for the fact that we're possessed by the past, that often is a traumatic past, that we want to be possessed, and that this traumatic past can also become a source of strength for the present. Because when you look at the play, right, she throws herself at the grave of a couple that was murdered during a traumatic event, and this physical contact with the grave gives her strength to rebel against what's happening in her life. But I think that this fascination with the Dybbuk has transcended the Jewish world. The non-Jews are engaging with the Dybbuk as well. So, for instance, in Poland in particular, there have been many Dybbuk productions in the recent 3 decades or so. And it's again a fascinating phenomenon, right? Because the situation in Poland is very complicated in terms of history. The Holocaust history was never really processed. There was sort of like a freeze of the communist era during which the Holocaust narrative was distorted. It was said the Second World War, it was Polish citizens who suffered. The Jews were not included in the narrative. So to change this falsified version of history that has been instilled in generations that were born after the war, it's a long process. And so one of my sort of understandings is that the non-Jewish Polish artists are using the Dybbuk to address this repressed guilt about the Holocaust and to talk about the still not processed Polish Jewish history. So the Dybbuk has become a kind of a malleable cultural metaphor, right, that can be applied to many aspects. And I think that sort of like the big takeaway from this fascination with the Dybbuk is that I think, and this is my argument, that it challenges the modern and postmodern relationship with the past. Because when you think about modernist movement, sort of the beginning of the 20th century, it was like, okay, on this day, I forget the date, 1910, the world changed, right? We don't care about the past anymore. We are now moving forward. That's it. But the 21st century showed that we cannot really cut off the past. We cannot really reject it. And I think this engagement with the Dybbuk in modern cultural imaginaries restores this connection with the past. Because in order to know who we are, we need to know where we came from. And in order to know where we're going. So I think the Dybbuk helps us better understand who we are and where we came from.
Well, Professor Agi Legutko, I think we can leave it there. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
so much for having me.